Miracles of Jesus, part 2. We're going to 3 lessons on Jesus and the importance of understanding his miracles. I read at the beginning in our announcements, part of the Sermon on the Mount that's probably one of the most difficult parts. When Jesus says, if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Or to love your enemy as you love your neighbor. It's one thing to get along with and to talk with and be at ease with people that you like and that are always friendly and encouraging to you. It's one thing when someone's out to get you, or even if your neighbor really is your neighbor across the fence, or your neighbor is someone you work with. It's very difficult. To apply these teachings of Jesus is extremely hard. And every one of us, starting with me, is going to need help because you're not going to want to do it. Your emotions are going to be involved. You're going to be angry. You're going to be frustrated. And you're going to just not want to have anything to do with that person, or maybe even go after them at some point physically. So how to really believe that you have to do that? If you don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that he speaks authoritatively, you're probably not going to do it because you're not going to feel like doing it. But Jesus tells us the toughest things we'll ever be told to do, but he backs it up with giving authority for who he is, that is the Son of God. And he speaks from the Father as the Son of God to tell us, here's what we ought to do because he's our creator. And these miracles affirm that role relationship. So we're going to look more at the miracles of Jesus today to see how important they were to who he claimed to be. Even if you tell someone, hey, you just need to read the Bible, and you tell them to read the Gospel of Mark, which is the shortest, they're going to run into multiple miracles immediately in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And don't think they're just going to go right through that and accept it. They might say, well, I appreciate some things Jesus said, but are these things for real? How would you answer that? Don't ever tell them just believe it in your heart because you don't know how to answer it. Here's credible source material to give them and to simply support your own faith for Jesus being who he claimed to be. So we're going to look this morning at 11 distinctive features of Jesus' miracles. 11, probably don't attempt, Ricardo, to write all this down. This is one of those lessons. But part of the reason for these lessons, just to throw this out there, show you how much there is. And if you choose to focus on different parts of it later, that's a great thing. But there's an overwhelming amount of evidence for the credibility of these. And first of all, what I've mentioned in other lessons, what we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is social science documentation. A lot of people that discount the Bible say, well, I want to follow the science. Well, they think science is only like electricity or atoms or things like that. But if you have a high school student, as you do, they take 4 years of social science, which is mainly history. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are social science. They're historical accounts. Just look at Luke chapter 3. I'll pick some of these verses to look at. Luke roots himself in history when he's talking about the beginning of the ministry of John the Baptist. Notice how deeply he places himself in history. He writes, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. Verse 2, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. These are all Roman and Jewish figures of history that have all been substantiated as living even outside of the Bible. But Luke is going out of his way to point out, here's exactly when Jesus lived. Here's exactly when John the Baptist did what he did. They root themselves in history. All 4 of the gospel writers do this. So Jesus' miracles are recorded in historical documents. Number 2, as we looked at 2 weeks ago, there is a sufficient number of miracles to examine. We don't just have one that we wrestle with, like the man born blind in John chapter 9, and, well, we just got to put everything on one miracle. There's at least 35, and depending how you count the miracles, there's 37. That's a lot to look at. And then John says, and the other writer says, there's many more things he did, but John says, these are written that you might believe. So they narrowed it down, but they narrowed it down to 37. That's a lot to look at, which is always in the favor of serious investigators of truth. Number 3, the miracles were executed with relative ease. Go ahead and turn to the Gospel of Mark. We'll probably look the most in Mark's Gospel. what I want you to see about miracles is there was not a lot of energy putting it into, okay, this is going to be a miracle that's going to start at 10:30 and it's going to go through maybe 3:30 in the afternoon. It's going to take a long time to heal this person. You never find anything like that. You not only find these miracles happening almost always instantaneously, but always you find them happening effortlessly, where Jesus didn't have to tug and pull with somebody and put them in a headlock and trying to work like a chiropractor with someone, and where maybe someone might think, well, maybe he's just kind of working him out of his problems. You find what we're going to see here. Look at Mark chapter 1, verse 31. The healing of Simon Peter's mother-in-law, verse 29, beginning Mark 1. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the mother Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. Verse 11, Mark 1. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her. Then it says, and she began to wait on them. A lot of women laugh at this. Yeah, they wanted her to start cooking and cleaning right after she got healed from a deadly disease. But it shows how quickly she recovered and how quickly the miracle happened, that she was up and working right away. And the effect on the people, verse 32, and that evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and the demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door. And Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. So here the credibility of what he did passed on to the crowd, where they knew something significant had happened with Simon Peter's mother-in-law. Verse 41. Man with leprosy, starting with verse 40, Mark 1, a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Then verse 42, immediately the leprosy left him and he was clean. Well, just look at those two. That's what you find consistently along these 37 miracles, an instantaneous healing and an effortless healing, where there's no room for some natural resumption of health that would have happened anyway, or for a bunch of hocus pocus stuff to be done, or Jesus really just kind of being a really good person at fooling people. Things happened right away and in front of everyone. There was no showmanship, stages. Jesus never said, well, we got to move over to this area because this is where I do miracles, like some kind of Hollywood or Las Vegas magician. He never had to have a place to do the miracles. He never had special assistants, like, okay, Simon, you move over here, and Andrew, get behind me here. We're going to heal this person. He never did that. He just touched, or most of the time he spoke, and people were healed. There was no extra time needed to do it. He didn't ever say, get back with me tomorrow at 10 a.m. and we'll see how you're doing. Nothing like that. These things were clearly acts of God. Number 4, they were performed in public places. Look at Mark chapter 1, 31 and 32 again. There's a big crowd around Simon Peter's mother-in-law. He went and took her hand and helped her. The fever left her, and she went to wait on them. She was already around a group, and then she starts waiting on them. And then the whole town comes. Verse 32. The people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed because they had seen it. They had heard about it. It wasn't something always that they had to think, well, what happened in the corner over there? Jesus was almost always in public, on mountains, among crowds, in prominent areas and cities. And there's all kinds of verses that simply emphasize how public these miracles were. Number 5, the miracles Jesus demonstrated exhibited powers of knowledge and insight. Sometimes they were healing, or many times they were healing, I should say, or the casting out of demons, but sometimes he simply knew what people were thinking and he challenged them on that. In Mark chapter 2, verse 6, it says, now some of the teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, why does this fellow talk like that? That's Jesus. He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Verse 8, immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this is what they were thinking in their hearts. And he said to them, why are you thinking these things? Which is easier to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat and walk. But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So notice here his miracles were done to establish his authority, but here he even knew what they were thinking. And he was accurate on that. So his ability as the Son of God to know what a person was thinking is also demonstrated in a miraculous way. Number 6, his miracles were multi-dimensional in scope. He had power over disease, amputation, paralysis, blindness, and even death, the raising of Lazarus in John chapter 11. Jesus didn't have just one miracle. Like I can hear eyesight, but I can't hear hearing loss. He never had simply to have the right thing at the right time. He had the full spectrum of things that he did, even raising people back to life. Bringing multiple amounts of food, like the feeding of the 5,000, the 4,000, or raising someone back to life, he could do it. Mark chapter 1 again, verse 40. A man with leprosy, an incurable skin disease. It says a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, if you're willing, you can make me clean. So every condition that they could not answer in that time, Jesus answered by his miraculous power. Even when he's about to be taken off to be tried and then eventually crucified, he healed a man's ear. Who cut off the ear, remember? Which one of the disciples tried to defend Jesus? Peter. Took a sword and tried cutting off the head. The guy ducked, took off an ear, and here Jesus put that ear back in place, fully healed him right in front of everyone. Man born blind. Everyone knew he'd been blind, not just people that came to an auditorium and had to believe that he had been born blind. And then the resurrection. Number 7, Jesus' miracles were reasonable and dignified. This is very important. You never see Jesus doing card tricks. Sometimes when you walk the streets of New York City, these guys will set up tables and they do these tricks with cards or with cups, and you try to guess where the ball went and things like that. You never see Jesus trying to do that, trying to entertain people or just do tricky things. There were no illusions where he made like a horse appear and then disappear, or a half person, you could only see half the person. No rabbits out of the hat, no flying cows, nothing like that. The miracles were instead, number 8, altruistic in nature. They were always designed to benefit someone, whether it was the feeding of the 5,000 or the 4,000, simply because people were very hungry and they'd been with Jesus all day, or the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, or the healing of someone with leprosy or blindness, or especially demonic possession, where they could not address that problem themselves. That you find consistent among Jesus' miracles. You never find him just walking along the roads, hey, watch what I do here, Peter, and turning a tree upside down or something like that. You don't find humorous or comical things where he ever uses power simply to entertain. They were always used. His powers were always used simply to affirm that he was God himself and they ought to listen to him. And then also he had the power to forgive sins. Sometimes he would even challenge people. Look at John chapter 5. This is an interesting one. Just to show how that Jesus wasn't just always going around snapping his fingers and then instantly things happening and he wouldn't even stop and things like that. Sometimes he would challenge the people that he was healing, recognizing there was maybe a deeper condition within them that needed to be addressed. John chapter 5, verse 1. We'll go through verse 8. Notice how Jesus did this miracle, but in the context of challenging a person who didn't think they could do anything different in their life. Verse 1 of John 5, it says, sometime later, Jesus went to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there was in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, do you want to get well? Sir, the invalid replied, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. Well, I'm trying to get in. Someone else goes ahead of me. Verse 8, then Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat and walk. At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. Many Bible students have noticed he kind of challenged this man on how serious he wanted to be healed. But notice he was in a very public place. He'd been invalid for 38 years. And when Jesus actually healed him. It says, instantly the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. Here he takes the mat he's been laying on for 38 years and walks away with it in between his arms. That's how instantaneous the miracles were. But also, again, they were done for the purpose of benefiting someone, never simply to entertain or to show off. Let's look at the last three. We'll spend a little more time with them. Number 9, as far as the distinctive qualities or features of Jesus' miracles. They possessed the testimony of eyewitnesses. And not just an inner circle. It would be one thing in the Bible if we just had Jesus doing miracles in front of the apostles. Because sometimes you could say, well, you just have this inner group maybe of brainwashed people that would believe anything they saw or anything they were told that happened. And that would probably be a meaningful challenge, even though later on, some recorded in the Bible, some outside the Bible, they were put to death because of what they believed, and that's pretty credible. But here, these miracles were done in front of thousands at time. The feeding of the 5,000, feeding of 4,000 twice. That's a lot of people. They could say, hey, I showed up with nothing. I didn't expect to hear teaching all day. Then all of a sudden, some little boy apparently had 7 loaves and 2 small fish. And all of a sudden, we all were fed. There were thousands of us, and there was even some left over. I mean, these people would go on to tell other people, and then other people about, we don't know how this food showed up. And back in the first century, there was not a Jack in the Box over here or an In-N-Out. Food didn't just show up. You had to be prepared or brought it. So all of a sudden, for have that food there, you had a lot of people that could testify that they actually experienced something very real. And if something didn't happen, these would be a lot of people that could say, hey, that whole thing about us being fed that day, that never happened. We went home hungry. We don't know who's telling that. You don't find that. You find people being fed and no one challenging whether or not a miracle actually happened. The challenge that you do find is from religious leaders who recognize, hey, a big miracle has been done. We got to get rid of this guy because he's challenging our authority and he's telling people not to listen to us but instead to God. And they did not like that, but they couldn't ever answer the miracles. They had to do away with the miracle worker. So you have the possession of the testimony of eyewitness, and that's why Luke, when he says in Luke chapter 1, I put together eyewitness testimony. He could gather someone that was there in the feeding of the 4,000. Yep, I was one of them. I went home full. And this food was just showing up, and we never saw a DoorDash ever. And this food was just there. Number 10, you have the testimony of the beneficiaries. Look at Mark chapter 10. With many of the people healed, you don't have a name. You don't have a name. Or you don't have the names of the 5,000 that were fed, unless you want to include the apostles that were with Jesus. But in other cases, you do. Because that person was well known. Probably they went to church, and people that read these accounts could reference them. Mark chapter 10. Get over there myself. Bartimaeus. Anyone remember what Bartimaeus' affliction was? I think there's a children's song. Blindness. Blindness. Verse 46, Mark chapter 10. We'll talk about the significance of his name being mentioned. Verse 46 of chapter 10. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Verse 48, many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and said, call him. So they called the blind man. Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Go, said Jesus. Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. So many things to cite, whether it be the immediacy of the miracle, being something that eyesight, blindness, you cannot heal it, just like you cannot heal it today. You can maybe improve it, but if someone's blind, we do not know of people's sight being restored. But Jesus was the great healer. But notice what this man did after his healing. Did you catch that in verse 32? Immediately he received his sight and he followed Jesus along the road. Many believe the significance is that he would continue to be what's called a disciple, which means a follower of Jesus. He may not have been part of that inner circle and was not, but he continued. He recognized the power of what had been done to him. And he probably became a prominent part of the church eventually. And he was someone that early Christians would know of. Because here he was someone that could give direct testimony. Yeah, I was blind and you ought to hear about what I did to get Jesus' attention. And he called me out. So he's mentioned by name. So early Christians who were reading these accounts, who wanted to know the truth of it, as Luke said, they could call it Bartimaeus. Hey, Bartimaeus is here. And Bartimaeus could say, yeah, that's exactly what happened. So it's a source of credibility because certain individuals would live on and be followers of Jesus. So recipients were known and even named at times. What you don't find is mystery people kind of showing up out of the crowd. Like sometimes when you see these healings by some of these false TV evangelist types, they'll call someone out of the crowd that just comes running up or gets wheeled in and like, where did they come from? You just don't know. Maybe there's some credibility on some level. Do they have an affliction? But you don't really know where the person came from. And then they're just kind of brought up stage and people have things done to them and all of a sudden they disappear and the video clip ends. Instead, you have people that could verify what happened. Remember, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 about the resurrection, that over 500 brethren at once saw Jesus in his resurrected form. That means you could go to them. Someone could name names. Here's who saw him. Here's who saw him. You don't have mystery people that no one knows about saying that, yeah, these things were done and things like that. There were no people that Jesus healed, or not any people, I should say, that the crowd did not already know. The crowd already knows these people have these afflictions in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You don't have people coming out behind a rock somewhere. They had people that they'd lived with all their life being healed. And that's why it was such a powerful miracle. Finally, you have the testimony of enemies. It's one thing to have friendly people or inclined people saying, yeah, I saw this, or it was done, or yeah, I actually received the miracle myself. But look how the enemies responded. We'll look in our last two verses at Mark 3, and then we'll look at John 11. Mark 3, 1 through 6. What you find in the early chapters of Mark is multiple miracles being recorded. But you also notice in the early chapters of Mark increased hostility towards Jesus being recorded. Mark 3, verse 1, another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. So they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. That's the day you're not supposed to work. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, stand up in front of everyone. Then Jesus asked them, which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they remained silent, that is, his enemies. He looked around them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Verse 6 now. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might what? Kill Jesus. Notice here they didn't try to discredit the miracle. They didn't say, hey, this man was healthy yesterday when we saw him at 7-Eleven. They didn't ever do anything like that. They knew what had happened. But they did not want their position among the Jewish people taken away. So they began, Mark says, to plot with this other group of people how they might kill Jesus, how to get rid of him, but not how to discredit the miracle, because they couldn't. They saw it and everybody else did. So you have the testimony of enemies simply by their non-response. They never challenged what had happened. They just tried to figure out what they're going to do. Look how this is so true in the raising of Lazarus. Look at our final text, John chapter 11. John 11, 45 through 48. Lazarus brought back to life after 4 days. The entire chapter of John 11 dedicated to not only the raising of Lazarus from the dead, but the response to Lazarus being raised from the dead. We're going to look at 45 through 48. We'll just start with verse 43. This is the bringing of Lazarus back to life after 4 days in the grave. It says, verse 43, John 11, when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Just stop here. There's a miracle, raising someone from the dead. Here's how the enemies responded. Verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priest and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. That's their high council. What are we accomplishing, they ask. Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will what? Believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. We'll just stop here. This is amazing. Notice what they're acknowledging. These enemies say, here is this man performing many signs. They're not challenging whether or not he did it. They know he did it. And then they say in verse 48, if we let him go on like this, everyone will what? Believe in him. They know the power of what Jesus is doing. They never try to discredit the miracle. They try simply to get rid of Jesus, always plotting, always conniving, trying to find the right time and the right way to do it. And eventually they get Judas involved, and that's the way to do it because they cannot answer the miracles. So what you have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is possessing the greatest testimony of all, which is the enemies. Because basically the enemy said here, he's doing these signs. And everybody's going to keep believing him if he keeps on going. The enemies never denied the miracles. So as people begin reading Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and they encounter these miracles and they struggle with, did this really happen? Is this for real? Or are these made up things? You can point them to these different levels of evidence for these being credible. And starting with them being recorded in historical accounts. And with most people that are seeking to believe, or at least being general truth seekers, they're going to say, hey, this is some valid stuff. I need to explore this further. But what we'll look at in our final lesson next week is simply the most powerful challenges to these miracles by people that are really looking to discredit them. They recognize we've got to get rid of the miracle somehow. We'll look at what is said, and then we'll look how to answer those by more credible evidence than the claim against them. So we'll look at the challenges of critics in our next lesson. But just know that your faith is founded on fact. And know especially when Jesus tells you to do difficult things, to love your neighbor, to treat your enemy the right way, to pray for those who spitefully use you. And you don't want to do that. It's like, I don't want to. I want to sulk. I want to figure out how to get back. I want to hire an attorney. I want to do everything. But what Jesus calls me to do, understand when he tells you to do that, he's telling you that as a son of God. The authority of God is there, and he proved himself to be so many ways, and one of the most formidable ways is through these miracles. So our only response is, Jesus, where you lead, I will follow. What you say, I will do. And as Peter said, where shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Our Savior leads us. He saves us, but he also leads us in the right paths. And this morning, if you need to recenter your path and go back to the right way and start listening to Jesus, or make whatever decision you need to make to be an obedient follower, not just a friendly follower, but an obedient follower with Jesus. He tells you the truth as the Son of God, and he proved himself to be such.